genealogy. The rise and fall of the Habsburg dynasty spans continents and centuries, encompassing the Spanish Empire's golden age, the Holy Roman Empire's complexity, and Austria-Hungary's grandeur. Yet beneath the pomp and ceremony, the glittering ceremonies and magnificent palaces, lay a growing genetic disaster that would ultimately prove more destructive than any army, plague, or political revolution. This is the story of how one family's obsession with keeping power within their bloodline led to their complete destruction, a reminder that even the mightiest dynasties are subject to the unchanging laws of nature, and that the pursuit of genetic purity often leads to genetic catastrophe. The Habsburg dynasty's origins can be traced to the Swiss canton of Aargau in the 10th century, where they began as minor nobility with modest landholdings. Their name derives from their ancestral seat, Habsburg, meaning Hawk's Castle, a fitting symbol for a family that would eventually soar to unprecedented heights of European power. What began as a small noble house would, through strategic marriages and political maneuvering, evolve into the most powerful royal family in European history. The family's transformation from regional nobles to continental rulers began in earnest during the late medieval period. Through calculated marriages and military victories, the Habsburgs expanded their influence throughout the German-speaking regions of Central Europe. Their motto, Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry, perfectly encapsulated their strategy of expansion through matrimonial alliances rather than military conquest. In 1273, Rudolf the Fire became the first Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, establishing a precedent that would see the family dominate this prestigious title for centuries. The Holy Roman Empire, that complex political entity encompassing much of Central Europe, provided the Habsburgs with both legitimacy and vast territorial holdings. Through this position, they could influence the selection of bishops, control trade routes, and forge alliances that extended their power far beyond their original Austrian heartlands. The dynasty's reach expanded exponentially in 1496, when Maximilian Fur arranged the marriage of his son Philip to Joanna of Castile, daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. This single matrimonial alliance would prove to be one of the most consequential in European history, eventually bringing the vast Spanish Empire, including its New World territories, under Habsburg control. The marriage exemplified the Habsburg strategy. Rather than conquering foreign lands through warfare, they would inherit them through carefully planned unions. By the 16th century, Charles V had inherited an empire on which the sun never set. From his Habsburg ancestors, he received Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. From his Spanish grandmother Isabella, he inherited Castile, Aragon, and the rapidly expanding American colonies. From his Burgundian heritage came the wealthy Netherlands. Never before had one individual controlled such vast and diverse territories, stretching from the Americas to Eastern Europe, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. The sheer scope of Habsburg power during this period was unprecedented in European history. They controlled the silver mines of Peru and Mexico, the spice trade routes of the Spanish Netherlands, the fertile agricultural lands of Hungary and Bohemia, and the strategic alpine passes between northern and southern Europe. Their dominions encompassed dozens of languages, cultures, and religions, presenting both opportunities and challenges that would test even the most capable rulers. Yet even at the height of their power, the seeds of their eventual downfall were being planted. The vast expanse of Habsburg territories created a challenge that would haunt the dynasty for centuries: how to maintain control over such diverse and distant lands while preserving the unity of the ruling family. The solution they chose, intermarriage between Habsburg branches, seemed logical at the time, but would prove catastrophically short-sighted. The strategic brilliance of early Habsburg marriages gradually gave way to a more insular approach. As the family's power grew, so did their sense of exclusivity and their belief in the superiority of their bloodline. What had once been pragmatic political alliances began to transform into an obsession with maintaining pure Habsburg blood, setting the stage for the genetic disasters that would eventually destroy them. In the ruthless world of European politics during the 15th and 16th centuries, marriage was never about love. It was about power, territory, and survival. Royal families understood that matrimonial alliances could secure borders, prevent wars, and consolidate claims to contested thrones. For the Habsburgs, this reality would evolve into a strategy so extreme that it would ultimately seal their fate. What began as calculated political maneuvering would transform into an obsession with bloodline purity that defied biological wisdom. The practice of royal intermarriage was not unique to the Habsburgs, but no family pursued it with such systematic determination. Early Habsburg marriages were indeed strategic masterpieces. Philip I's marriage to Joanna of Castile brought Spain into the Habsburg fold, while other unions secured alliances with Portugal, England, and France. These marriages expanded Habsburg influence across Europe and established them as the continent's dominant dynasty. However, as the Habsburg territories grew and their power consolidated, their marriage strategies began to shift from external alliance building to internal consolidation. The family became increasingly concerned with preventing their vast holdings from fragmentating through inheritance by non-Habsburg heirs. The solution seemed obvious: marry within the family to ensure that Habsburg lands remained under Habsburg control and that the bloodline remained pure and untainted by foreign influence. By the mid-16th century, this strategy had evolved into a rigid system of endogamy, marriage within the same family group. Habsburg princes and princesses were systematically paired with their cousins, uncles, nieces, and even more distant relatives who shared Habsburg blood. Charles V married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. His son, Philip II, married his first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal, and later his niece, Anna of Austria, who was 21 years his junior. The Habsburg marriage practices became increasingly complex and disturbing as the generations progressed. Philip II's son, Philip III, married his second cousin, Margaret of Austria. Their son, Philip IV, married his first cousin, Elizabeth of France, and when she died, he married his niece, Mariana of Austria, who was 30 years younger than him. Each generation saw the genetic pool becoming smaller and more concentrated, with the same ancestral genes being combined and recombined in increasingly dangerous ways. The family developed elaborate genealogical charts to track relationships and ensure that marriages maintained Habsburg purity while ostensibly avoiding the closest degrees of consanguinity forbidden by the Catholic Church. However, these calculations focused on canonical law rather than biological reality. The church might permit marriage between first cousins or uncle and niece, but genetics operates according to different, more unforgiving laws. Courtiers and advisors occasionally raised concerns about the health implications of such close marriages, particularly as physical deformities and mental disabilities became increasingly common among Habsburg children. However, these concerns were systematically overruled by political considerations and the deeply ingrained belief that Habsburg blood was inherently superior to that of other noble families. The dynasty had convinced itself that their genetic material was so exceptional that it could only be improved through concentration, not dilution. The Habsburg family's commitment to endogamy created a marriage market that was entirely artificial and increasingly limited. As suitable Habsburg partners became scarcer, the age gaps between spouses grew larger, and the degree of genetic relationship became closer. What had once been a flexible strategy for building alliances had become a rigid doctrine that trapped successive generations in an ever-tightening genetic spiral, leading inevitably toward the catastrophe that would manifest most dramatically in the tragic figure of Charles II of Spain. To understand the Habsburg tragedy, we must first understand the merciless mathematics of genetics. Every human being carries two copies of each gene, one inherited from their mother, one from their father. When parents are unrelated, their children benefit from genetic diversity. Harmful recessive genes from one parent are usually masked by healthy dominant genes from the other. However, when closely related individuals reproduce, this protective genetic diversity disappears, and the consequences can be catastrophic. The concept of the inbreeding coefficient, developed by geneticist Sewall Wright, provides a mathematical measure of this genetic danger. The coefficient represents the probability that an individual has inherited identical copies of a gene from a common ancestor through both parents. In a population with no inbreeding, this coefficient is 0. For the offspring of first cousins, it's approximately 0.0625. For siblings, it reaches 0.25. Charles II of Spain achieved the nightmarish coefficient of 0.254, making him more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. This extraordinary level of inbreeding occurred because Charles II was not the product of a single incestuous marriage, but rather the culmination of centuries of Habsburg endogamy. His family tree, when mapped out, resembles not a branching tree, but a tangled web, where the same ancestors appear multiple times. Philip II of Spain appears in Charles II's family tree 14 times, and Emperor Charles V appears 8 times. Instead of having the typical complement of diverse ancestors, Charles II's genealogy showed a dramatic reduction in genetic variety. The biological consequences of such extreme inbreeding are predictable and severe. Harmful recessive genes, which would normally remain hidden in a diverse genetic background, become expressed when an individual inherits identical copies from both parents. These effects compound across multiple gene systems, affecting everything from physical development to cognitive function, immune system effectiveness, and reproductive capability. Inbreeding depression, as geneticists term this phenomenon, manifests in numerous ways. Physical deformities become common, as seen in the characteristic Habsburg jaw, a severely protruding lower mandible that made eating and speaking difficult. Developmental delays and cognitive impairments increase in frequency and severity. The immune system weakens, making individuals more susceptible to infections and diseases. Most critically for dynastic survival, fertility drops dramatically, with higher rates of infant mortality, miscarriages, and complete sterility. Research by Spanish geneticist Gonzalo Alvarez and his colleagues has demonstrated that the Habsburg family tree represents one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding in documented human history. By analyzing the genealogical records of 3,000 members of the Habsburg dynasty over 16 generations, they calculated inbreeding coefficients that reveal the systematic genetic deterioration of the family line. The study showed a clear correlation between the degree of inbreeding and the prevalence of physical and mental disabilities among Habsburg descendants. The Habsburg case also illustrates how inbreeding effects accumulate over generations. Early Habsburg marriages between more distant relatives produced relatively subtle effects, but as the practice continued and the genetic pool contracted, each subsequent generation faced increasingly severe consequences. The mathematical progression is relentless. Each generation of continued inbreeding builds upon the genetic damage of previous generations, creating a cascade of deterioration that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. Modern genetic analysis has identified specific conditions that likely plagued the later Habsburgs. The protruding jaw, known as mandibular prognathism, appears to have been caused by recessive genes that became fixed in the Habsburg line. Pituitary hormone deficiencies, which could explain the growth abnormalities and reproductive failures seen in later Habsburg rulers, also follow patterns consistent with inbreeding-related genetic disorders. The most visible and enduring symbol of Habsburg genetic deterioration was the distinctive facial deformity known as the Habsburg jaw or mandibular prognathism. This condition, characterized by a severely protruding lower jaw and chin, became so closely associated with the dynasty that it serves as a physical manifestation of their genetic decline. What began as a minor facial characteristic in early Habsburg portraits evolved over generations into a grotesque deformity that made basic functions like eating and speaking extremely difficult. The Habsburg jaw was not merely a cosmetic issue, it represented a fundamental structural malformation of the facial bones. The condition involves an abnormal growth of the lower mandible, causing it to extend far beyond the upper jaw. In severe cases, the lower teeth protrude well beyond the upper teeth, making it impossible for the individual to bite or chew properly. The tongue often becomes enlarged relative to the mouth cavity, leading to persistent drooling and speech impediments. Historical portraits of Habsburg rulers provide a visual timeline of this genetic deterioration. Early Habsburg monarchs like Maximilian I show only subtle hints of the jaw protrusion. However, as we progress through the family tree, the deformity becomes increasingly pronounced. Charles V displays a moderate version of the condition, his son Philip II shows more severe symptoms, and by the time we reach Charles II of Spain, the deformity had become so extreme that it dominated his entire facial structure. Contemporary accounts describe Charles II's jaw in disturbing detail. The Venetian ambassador noted that the king has a ravenous stomach and swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet. French courtiers reported that Charles could barely close his mouth and that food often fell out while he attempted to eat. The king's speech was so severely impaired that foreign diplomats required interpreters to understand him, even when he spoke in their native languages. Beyond the famous jaw, the Habsburgs suffered from numerous other physical deformities that became increasingly common with each generation. Hydrocephalus, an abnormal accumulation of fluid in the brain, appeared multiple times in the family line. This condition causes the head to become abnormally large and can lead to severe cognitive impairment. Several Habsburg children were born with this condition, and those who survived often suffered from developmental delays and learning disabilities. Skeletal abnormalities plagued the dynasty beyond the facial deformities. Many later Habsburgs displayed unusual proportions, with some having abnormally short stature, while others grew to unusual heights. Joint problems were common, with many family members suffering from severe arthritis at young ages. The Habsburg walk became characteristic, an unsteady, shuffling gait that reflected underlying neurological and skeletal problems. Skin conditions also became increasingly prevalent among the later Habsburgs. Contemporary accounts describe various forms of eczema, unusual pigmentation patterns, and premature aging. These conditions likely reflected the compromised immune systems that result from inbreeding, making individuals more susceptible to infections and inflammatory disorders. The reproductive system was particularly affected by the accumulated genetic damage. Many Habsburg men suffered from various degrees of sexual dysfunction and fertility problems. Women in the family experienced high rates of miscarriage and infant mortality. The inability to produce healthy offspring became a recurring theme in Habsburg history, with numerous marriages remaining childless despite desperate attempts at conception. Charles II of Spain stands as perhaps history's most tragic example of the consequences of systematic inbreeding. Born on November 6, 1661, he was the product of a marriage between Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria, a union that brought together 2 already heavily inbred Habsburg lineages. From the moment of his birth, it was clear that Charles represented the culmination of 2 centuries of genetic deterioration, embodying in his frail body the accumulated damage of countless close marriages. the infant Charles barely survived his early years. Contemporary accounts describe a sickly child who failed to meet basic developmental milestones. He did not speak until age 4, could not walk without assistance until age 8, and required constant medical attention throughout his childhood. Court physicians were baffled by the range and severity of his conditions, attributing his problems to everything from divine displeasure to witchcraft, never understanding that they were witnessing the inevitable result of genetic mathematics. As Charles matured, his physical deformities became increasingly apparent and disturbing. His jaw protruded so dramatically that he could not chew solid food properly, requiring a liquid diet for much of his life. His tongue was disproportionately large for his mouth, causing constant drooling and making speech nearly incomprehensible. Foreign ambassadors reported that interpreting the king's words required careful attention and often guesswork, even for native Spanish speakers. The king's body was as compromised as his face. He stood barely 5 feet tall, despite having tall ancestors. His limbs were disproportionate, and his posture was severely hunched. He suffered from frequent seizures that left him unconscious for hours, and his physicians reported episodes where he would lose control of his bodily functions. His hands trembled constantly, making it difficult for him to sign documents or perform basic tasks of governance. Charles II's mental capacity was severely limited, though the extent of his cognitive impairment was often masked by the elaborate court protocols that surrounded him. He had difficulty understanding complex concepts and relied heavily on advisors to make even basic decisions. His education was minimal, as tutors found it nearly impossible to maintain his attention or help him retain information. Yet he was expected to rule the vast Spanish Empire, with territories spanning from Europe to the Americas to Asia. The king's emotional state was equally troubling. Contemporary accounts describe him as prone to fits of rage, followed by periods of deep melancholy. He was reportedly terrified of his own reflection and would often refuse to look in mirrors. Court observers noted his childlike behavior well into adulthood, including an obsession with toys and games that was considered inappropriate for a monarch. He displayed signs of paranoia, convinced that enemies were plotting against him, though his fears were often based on delusions rather than reality. Sexual dysfunction plagued Charles throughout his adult life, creating a crisis for dynastic succession. Despite 2 marriages, he proved completely unable to father children. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, endured years of humiliating medical examinations as court physicians desperately sought explanations for the royal couple's childlessness. After her death, Charles married Maria Anna of Neuburg, but this union proved equally barren. The Spanish court's desperation regarding Charles's condition led to increasingly extreme measures. Exorcisms were performed regularly, as many believed the king was possessed by demons. Various physicians prescribed bizarre treatments, including the application of hot animal entrails to his body and the consumption of increasingly exotic substances. Court astrologers were consulted and elaborate rituals were performed to try to restore the king's health and virility. As Charles II's reign dragged on without producing an heir, the great powers of Europe watched with growing anticipation and anxiety. The Spanish Empire in 1700 encompassed not only the Iberian Peninsula, but also vast territories in the Americas, the Spanish Netherlands, and various Italian states. The question of who would inherit this global empire upon Charles's death became one of the most pressing diplomatic issues of the age, ultimately leading to a devastating continental war. The main claimants to the Spanish throne represented different branches of European royalty, each with legitimate genealogical arguments. Louis XIV of France claimed the inheritance for his grandson, Philip of Anjou, based on the marriage of his son to Charles II's older sister. Emperor Leopold I of Austria, Charles's cousin and fellow Habsburg, claimed the throne should pass to his second son, Archduke Charles, to keep the Spanish dominions within the broader Habsburg family. Other European powers had their own interests and preferred candidates. Charles II himself was acutely aware of the crisis his childlessness had created. In his more lucid moments, he understood that his death would likely trigger a European war. Various factions within the Spanish court lobbied intensively for different succession solutions, with some favoring the French Bourbon claim, while others supported maintaining Habsburg rule through the Austrian branch. The dying king changed his will multiple times, reflecting both his own uncertainty and the intense pressure from competing court factions. In October 1700, Charles II finally made his decision, naming Philip of Anjou as his universal heir in his final will. The choice was influenced by several factors: the French candidate's closer blood relationship to Charles through the female line, French military power that could protect Spanish territories, and the argument that the Spanish dominions should remain intact under a single ruler rather than being partitioned among multiple claimants. When Charles II died on November 1, 1700, at age 38, his death marked not just the end of his personal suffering, but the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line. The autopsy report, conducted by Spanish court physicians, provides a grotesque catalogue of his internal deformities. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines putrefied, and he had only a single testicle, black as carbon. These findings, while described in the medical terminology of the time, clearly indicate the systematic organ failure that resulted from his extreme inbreeding. The European powers' reaction to Charles's will and France's acceptance of the Spanish inheritance was swift and decisive. The prospect of French control over the Spanish Empire threatened to upset the carefully maintained balance of power that had kept Europe relatively stable. Austria refused to accept the French succession, and soon England, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, and several German states joined what became known as the Grand Alliance against France and Spain. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, became one of the most devastating conflicts in European history up to that time. Battles raged across multiple continents, from the fields of Flanders to the mountains of Spain, from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean. The war featured some of history's greatest military commanders, including the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy, and saw innovations in military tactics and strategy that would influence warfare for centuries. The human cost of the war was staggering. Historians estimate that between 400,000 and 1.25 million people died as a direct result of the conflict, with millions more suffering from war-related famines, diseases, and economic disruption. Entire regions were devastated by the fighting, and the economic consequences of the war affected European development for decades. All of this carnage can be traced back to one man's inability to father children, an inability that was itself the direct result of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. The War of the Spanish Succession fundamentally transformed the European balance of power and marked the beginning of the end for Habsburg dominance. The treaties of Utrecht, 1713, and Rastatt, 1714, that concluded the war, represented more than a simple territorial redistribution. They symbolized the failure of the Habsburg strategy of dynastic unity through inbreeding. The once unified Habsburg domains were permanently divided, with profound consequences that would reshape European politics for centuries. Under the peace settlements, Philip V was confirmed as King of Spain, but was required to renounce any future claims to the French throne, preventing the union of the two Bourbon crowns that had so terrified the rest of Europe. However, Spain was forced to cede significant territories to other powers. The Austrian Habsburgs received the Spanish Netherlands, the Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Kingdom of Sardinia. Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca, establishing its permanent presence in the Mediterranean. The partition of the Spanish Empire marked the end of Habsburg Spain as a great power. The loss of European territories was devastating enough, but the psychological impact was even greater. For 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs had justified their inbreeding practices partly through the argument that they needed to maintain the unity of their vast dominions. The territorial losses demonstrated that this strategy had failed completely. The empire fragmented despite centuries of genetic sacrifice. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg family, while gaining Spanish territories, faced its own challenges. Emperor Leopold III had died during the war in 1705, and his son Joseph III died childless in 1711, forcing Archduke Charles to abandon his Spanish claims to become Emperor Charles VI. The Austrian Habsburgs now ruled a collection of disparate territories that lacked the wealth and global reach of the former Spanish Empire. Charles VI, despite becoming Holy Roman Emperor, was haunted by the same succession problems that had destroyed the Spanish line. His own marriage to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel was arranged for political reasons, and while she bore him children, only 2 daughters survived to adulthood. Charles spent much of his reign trying to secure international acceptance of the Pragmatic Sanction, which would allow his daughter Maria Theresa to inherit his domains, despite Salic law traditions that favored male succession. The genetic legacy of Habsburg inbreeding continued to plague the Austrian line, though not as severely as it had affected their Spanish cousins. Physical deformities and mental disabilities appeared with troubling frequency among Austrian Habsburg descendants. Many children died in infancy. Marriages remained childless, and those who survived often struggled with health problems that undermined their ability to rule effectively. The social and economic consequences of Habsburg decline extended far beyond the royal family itself. The Spanish Empire's weakness following the War of Spanish Succession contributed to its gradual loss of American territories over the following centuries. The economic disruption caused by territorial losses and war debts created social unrest and political instability that would periodically erupt into revolution and civil war. The intellectual climate of the Enlightenment also began to challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying Habsburg rule. Philosophers and political theorists questioned the divine right of kings, the legitimacy of hereditary monarchy, and the wisdom of dynastic marriages. The Habsburg example became a cautionary tale used by critics of aristocratic privilege and supporters of meritocratic government systems. The Austrian Habsburg line continued for another 2 centuries after the extinction of their Spanish cousins, but the genetic damage from centuries of inbreeding created recurring crises that ultimately contributed to the dynasty's final collapse in 1918. Each generation faced the familiar challenges: high infant mortality, physical deformities, mental instability, and fertility problems that threatened dynastic continuity. The Habsburg genetic legacy had created a royal house that was simultaneously blessed with vast territories and cursed with biological weakness. Maria Theresa, who inherited the Austrian domains in 1740, represented something of a genetic recovery for the family. Her marriage to Francis of Lorraine introduced new genetic material into the Habsburg line, and their 16 children suggested that the worst effects of inbreeding might be overcome through outbreeding. However, the couple's children still showed signs of the accumulated genetic damage, with several suffering from physical deformities, mental illness, or developmental problems that affected their ability to rule effectively. The most famous of Maria Theresa's children, Marie Antoinette, married Louis XVI of France and became a symbol of royal excess and disconnection from popular concerns. While her tragic fate during the French Revolution was primarily due to political circumstances, some historians have noted her emotional instability and poor judgment as potentially reflecting Habsburg genetic influences. Her inability to initially produce an heir also echoed the fertility problems that had plagued her Habsburg ancestors. Franz Joseph Defarge, who ruled Austria-Hungary from 1848 to 1916, embodied both the persistence and the ultimate futility of Habsburg rule. Despite his long reign and genuine attempts at reform, he was plagued by personal tragedies that seemed to echo the family's cursed history. His son Rudolf committed suicide, his wife Elizabeth was assassinated, and his nephew and heir Franz Ferdinand was murdered in Sarajevo, triggering World War I. The Great War proved to be the final blow to Habsburg power. The multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, already strained by nationalist tensions and economic problems, could not survive the stress of a prolonged world war. The military defeat, economic collapse and social revolution that followed led to the empire's dissolution and the Habsburg family's exile. On November 11, 1918, Emperor Charles I renounced participation in state affairs, effectively ending 6 centuries of Habsburg rule.